So Russia and the United Kingdom are at war already. It's not a formally declared war, it's a war in the grey zone. Why am I saying that? Because if you look at the warlike activity that's happening, it's happening on a daily basis. Russian cyber attacks are coming into our country every day, tens of them every day. We don't hear about them in the press. We've seen Russian-affiliated drones flying over US Air Force bases. We've seen drones flying over Gatwick Airport in the past, possibly linked to Russia. We've seen assassinations on the streets of London. Alexander Litvinenko with polonium-210 many years ago. Sergei and Yulia Skripal assassination attempts on Salisbury with Novichok. It can be linked to Russia. The polonium-210 could only come from one reactor. That was in Russia. We've seen Russian attacks on warehouses in London, storing supplies going to Ukraine. They're being burnt down. They were burnt down by a criminal gang that had been recruited and tasked by the Russian GRU. We've seen attacks on our former Prime Minister's private property by a number of different men that had been recruited. Some of them were Ukrainian, but it's clear that they had been recruited by Russian intelligence to carry this out as part of a disinformation campaign and a campaign to try and disrupt our political thinking. We're seeing us being attacked on a regular basis with our critical national infrastructure going across the Channel and out into the Atlantic. The Russian spy ship, the Yantar, with some of its submersibles, have been down mapping and looking at our critical infrastructure, working out how they can target it. There's always been suspicion that they may have dropped explosive charges around there. We see Russian warships in the Channel escorting their tanker fleet, this dark fleet vessels through the Channel so they don't get intercepted by the Royal Navy. And we've seen that Russian warship fire shots at a British registered sailing yacht going across the Channel. All of this is happening on a daily basis. And we're seeing Russian disinformation campaigns hitting our politicians, hitting all of the news that is being fed to everyone across the country on a daily basis. That is why I say we're at war with Russia at the moment and in the grey zone. And we are retaliating to a degree in the cyber domain with our support for Ukraine, supplying one-way attack drones and other military material to attack the Russians. And in the information domain, we're just not as good in the information domain as the Russians are to us. So the next question is, if we're at war now, is there a danger of it becoming bigger and turning into a shooting war that we get involved in? There's always a danger. So what are we likely to see? What's been happening? The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has turned around and said there will be consequences for the UK supplying one-way attack drones for Ukraine to attack into Russia itself. And this week, we've seen the first reported attacks of one-way attack drones against targets in Russia itself. Of course, we've been supplying the Storm Shadow cruise missiles that have attacked into Russia in the past. But is Sergei Lavrov right? Are we going to see the consequences? What would those consequences look like? Initially, I think these consequences will look like an escalation of the activity that they're doing at the moment. We could see more warehouses burning down. We could see attacks against some of our military industrial base across the UK. BAE Systems, where the one-way attack drones are manufactured, being attacked from a cyber perspective, but also Sabotage potentially. There's a lot of groups around the UK that have in the past naively attacked into British military bases. We saw Palestine Action attacking into the RAF base at Bryce Norton and spraying aircraft. It wouldn't take much to try and get a group like that to bring in an explosive device and leave that against possibly an airfield base or possibly an army base or somewhere else. And therefore, I think what we could see in the coming weeks and months is an escalation in what this Russian grey zone activity is doing. That escalation could result in more physical attacks happening across the country. Is that ultimately going to lead to a conflict and us responding in the same way? No, there are several more steps to go before we get to that. So what would those next steps be? Well, this is from a theoretical perspective, and I'm a military planner. When we're looking at things from a planning perspective. We look at worst case, we look at best case, we look at most likely. So what I'm going to describe to you here is worst case with a little bit of embellishment, but it's to make you think about it. So what could the worst case be? We're seeing escalation. Our current Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, turns around and calls a Cabinet Office briefing room, COBR meeting. We mistakenly in the press call it COBRA from time to time. It's actually Cabinet Office Briefing Room Alpha. That's the one with the most secure communications with all of the different agencies. They're discussing what might be happening with the attacks against our defence infrastructure, with possibly more attacks using Novichok or polonium or some other novel agent on the streets of the UK against Russian dissidents. We may see the CEO of some of the defence companies, their houses being attacked or them being assassinated. We're seeing more warehouses potentially being burnt down. We're seeing a massive increase in cyber attacks. And Andy Burnham wants to discuss that with the head of our intelligence agencies, the head of the military, the head of the security services, and with some of our police leads, in particular the head of the Metropolitan Police, trying to work out what we can do and how we can respond. He realizes that he wants to do something to send a clear message to the Russians that it is unacceptable, this increase in attack, increased number of attacks against the UK. The Russians are denying that they're involved in any of it, as they would do, as they have done across the board. But Andy Burnham rightly doesn't believe them. He's a bold Prime Minister. He decides to take action. And that action he takes is looking at Russian Shadow Fleet vessels. We've seen Keir Starmer, the previous Prime Minister, order the arrest of one of them. Andy Burnham decides to go for a number of them that are around the British coast at the same time, to send a clear message back to Moscow, leave us alone. So Special Forces, the Royal Marines, supporting Border Force, are tasked to attack and capture a number of Russian Shadow Fleet vessels coming down the North Sea, going through the English Channel, out into the Irish Sea and elsewhere. 5, 10, 15. He wants to send a very clear message. At the same time, he calls the Russian ambassador in and expels a number of Russian diplomats from the embassy, thinking that this will send a clear message to Moscow and Moscow will back down and move away from what it's doing. Unfortunately, in this worst case scenario, Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin don't back down. They take this as an escalation. And therefore what they do is they call in the British ambassador in Moscow and they expel a large percentage of diplomats from Moscow. They then attack British merchant vessels that are operating down in Southeast Asia, around the South China Seas. The Russians go and arrest those vessels. They look at seeing if they can do the same in any other parts of the world, but in reality, the Baltic, they can't control. The Atlantic, they can't control. The Mediterranean, they can't control. Around Africa, it would be too difficult for them to get combat power there, so they focus on Southeast Asia. A couple of British vessels are arrested, and Andy Burnham calls another Cabinet Office briefing room meeting to sit down and work out what's happening. The Russians have increased the escorts that they've got for their grey fleet ships going through the channel. They've put another couple of cruisers in there, and those cruisers are trigger happy. There have been one or two incidences where Border Force vessels have got close, or Royal Navy vessels shadowing them have got close, and shots have been fired across the bow. The Navy vessels haven't responded, but the Russians are clearly concerned. The next thing that Vladimir Putin may decide to do is to send the UK a very clear message. And what he does is the Russian spy ship Yantar has provided all the survey of the undersea cables. One of the Russian Shadow Fleet tankers, as it's going down through the channel, just happens to drag its anchor across a number of the cables that are connecting the UK to mainland Europe. We've got a major electricity connection from the UK to mainland Europe. Some of the data pipelines and our main electricity connector are snagged and are cut by this Russian Shadow Fleet tanker. Andy Burnham is now incandescent with anger. He carries out another Cabinet Office briefing room meeting to try and turn around and say to the chief of the defence staff and to his foreign secretary and get their advice as to what they can do next. Again, they say everything that we do will be taken as an escalation. So Andy Burnham says, but I need to send another clear message. How's he going to send that other clear message? A possibility is he decides to deal with the ship that they have identified that dragged its anchor, and instead of arresting it, he's assessed it and knows that it isn't full of oil or it hasn't got hazardous cargo on it. He decides to sink it, and he orders the Royal Navy to sink the vessel. The Royal Navy attack it and sink it, and Moscow then take that as a declaration of war against the United Kingdom. How would that likely look? Could Russia hit the United Kingdom with conventional forces, or would the United Kingdom be safe if something like that happened? Well, the only forces that Russia could hit the United Kingdom with are missile forces. Now, those missiles, we're talking of medium range and intercontinental range ballistic missiles. The difficulty with those is they can carry conventional warheads and they can carry nuclear warheads. And the only time you know which warhead it's carrying is when it goes bang. Were we likely to see targeted? Well, if the Russians wanted to send another clear message back, military naval bases, military airfields, potentially seats of government outside London. I don't think the Russians would go for London, first of all, because they're concerned that the UK has got a nuclear deterrent and they don't want to do anything that would trigger anything above that. Meanwhile, whilst all of this is going on and we're seeing escalation and Russia hasn't fired any ballistic missiles yet, Andy Burnham has been on to his NATO colleagues. With the arrest of the British vessels in Southeast Asia, Andy Burnham has sent his foreign secretary to NATO to bring out Article 4 of NATO, which is a collective wagging of the finger against the Russians. As our foreign secretary has tried to get NATO to come together and produce an Article 4 statement, a very clear statement to Russia that their activity is unacceptable, we're seeing the Americans potentially going, we don't necessarily want to sign up to this. And we're seeing one or two other European nations saying, this might be a little bit strong at the moment. We haven't been attacked. Nothing has happened to us. We are not happy about doing this. Russia will know that, and Russia will see that as a sign of weakness. And they'll see the fact that NATO is not coming together and potentially make an assessment that if they're not going to come together under Article 4, they may not come together under Article 5. And if Putin and Lavrov see that and make a decision, that's when they could launch one or two limited ballistic missile strikes against the UK. As soon as that happens, we're in a completely different game. That, folks, is war. So Putin and Lavrov turn around and make a decision that they are not seeing unity in NATO. They want to send a very clear message to the UK. They want the UK to shut up and go away. We have never been the flavour of the month in Moscow. So what they decide to do is fire 3 or 4 ballistic missiles at the United Kingdom. They're not going to be at London. They may be in the outskirts. They're more likely to be at a naval base in Portsmouth. They're more likely to be at potentially government communications headquarters in Cheltenham. They're likely to be at some of the other spy bases, or RAF Waddington, where some of our spy planes fly from, sending a clear message. As soon as that happens, we've crossed the line. We're into a shooting war. Andy Burnham will be calling, in fact, he won't need to call. There'll almost be a permanent cabinet office briefing room meeting going on. The seats of government will move out into dispersed headquarters and nuclear-proof bunkers so that government can be kept going. The Foreign Secretary will be working the phones and physical meetings with as many NATO members as possible, because if those ballistic missiles have gone bang, he will be asking for a NATO Article 5 escalation against Russia, so that from a collective perspective, NATO can be seen to come together. With Donald Trump in power, the American support for that is not necessarily guaranteed. And this is where Donald Trump may turn around and say, hey, I support you, UK, but I'm not signing up to Article 5 at the moment because I don't want to start the Third World War. It's distinctly possible that one or two European nations will turn around, and European members of NATO will turn around and say exactly the same thing. We can guarantee the Baltic states, Poland, possibly Germany, possibly France, and some of the other European nations will sign up to support the United Kingdom. Denmark will come on side to support the United Kingdom on an Article 5. A clear message will be to Moscow that there is if there's not a NATO collective response, there is a coalition of the willing starting to come together. Putin and Lavrov will know that if NATO comes together and it results in an attack going in against Russia itself, they couldn't handle it. They have suffered enough in Ukraine. But if they can keep the United Kingdom isolated, so once those ballistic missiles come in, we'll start to see Russia doing what Russia does and playing the diplomatic games. It will start a diplomatic offensive against the United States. It will start a diplomatic offensive against a number of different countries that are members of NATO, but in the EU, to turn around and say, hey, it's not us escalating. The UK started this by arresting our ships. The UK started this by sinking our one of our Shadow Fleet vessels. We are just responding in kind. We want to back off and slow down. That's what we're going to see out of Moscow. That will help create indecision across NATO. That will help create indecision elsewhere. And it will make the UK feel even more isolated, because the UK knows that if it responds in kind, that will be seen as an escalation. Moscow will paint it as an escalation and could attack even further. We're in a dilemma here. The UK doesn't have a conventional ballistic missile that we can respond with. We have cruise missiles, and we can use those, and we could use those against selected targets. That would be the next step. However, those targets, attacking those could then escalate and cause the Russians to attack with even more ballistic missiles. We could do nothing, but then we'd lose face, and Moscow would see this as a victory and know that the United Kingdom is weak. Or we could provide additional support into Ukraine, and with that, potentially unilaterally declare a no-fly zone across Ukraine and provide RAF capability in there. And potentially, if we wanted to escalate there, to attack Russian positions in occupied Ukraine and persuade President Zelensky in Ukraine to request that we provide that support. There's nothing to stop Zelensky doing that. There's nothing to stop us on a bilateral agreement between two countries coming in and providing support, and the UK could justify that in the same way that Russia is asking North Korea to provide troops, ballistic missiles and other military material. That is the next logical step of what Andy Burnham may decide to do. The difficulty is what that's then doing is sucking the United Kingdom more formally into the war in Ukraine. Whatever way, in whatever scenario, we're seeing a potential for the UK to get more involved in a shooting war. That's why, in reality, we're seeing so much caution across all of our activities at the moment. So I've said, support for Ukraine and getting things in there is one of the options. Russia may decide that that is an escalation, and Russia, if it decided that was an escalation, attack with more ballistic missiles and fire ballistic missiles into London, attacking our centre of government, fire ballistic missiles and causing mass civilian casualties across the United Kingdom. And it would probably then fire ballistic missiles into the seats of government in Kyiv and elsewhere as well. That would give Andy Burnham a real dilemma, because our only proper response to that would be to carry out a direct attack against Moscow or elsewhere. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council will have met. There will be condemnation coming out, whether the United States and France back the UK or whether they abstain would be of interest. Russia will almost certainly get support from China, but China may abstain. This may remain a UK and Russian issue, not wanting to escalate it. Diplomatic activity will be going on around the world to try and de-escalate. But as soon as other nations recognise that there could be a threat to them, the Russians have decided that the only way to de-escalate further would be not just to continue the threat against the UK, but to then threaten against some other NATO nations. They've decided a weak point in NATO could be the Sabotage Gap, that is between Belarus and Kaliningrad, and that they want to close that because they want to bring the forces in Kaliningrad in. They could get the Belarusian forces to attack through and try and secure that gap. That would bring the Baltic states and Poland into a direct attack on land. As soon as we get into that scenario, that's where we're in the game of NATO Article 5 definitely coming in, and whether the United States would be an active part in that or just supporting from the sidelines would be a big question mark, but we're in the game of World War III. How would it turn into a global conflict? Well, if we started to see that, Xi Jinping may decide that given the low stocks of US weapons, given an escalation of a war in Europe, that would be the time for him to take Taiwan by military force. If he took Taiwan by military force or started a posture for that, the Japanese may decide that the Russians are focused on an increasing war in Europe. They decide that now is the time for them to take a Kuril Island back that Russia has occupied since the end of the Second World War. They've always said they want it back. They decide to attack into that. Whilst that is going on, we're seeing Europe and Southeast Asia. The Middle East is continuing to boil away in what's going on. The rump of Iran is being used to try and fix the Americans a little bit more and keep a couple of their carrier battle groups focused there. So we see an escalation from the Houthis, from Hamas, Hezbollah, and other different groups that there are across the Middle East. And of course, then we have a plausibly deniable little bad boy, and that's Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He's sitting there watching everything that's happening, and he goes, actually, you know, I've now got more material from Russia, I've got more technology from Russia. With what's going on elsewhere, there isn't support for South Korea. Now is the time for me to reunify the Korean peninsula. And he fires a nuclear weapon at Seoul. That is World War III. So this is merely one scenario, and it is the worst case scenario with a little bit of poetic license added into it. So please, if you've got any comments, put them below. If you like this, like it, and share it amongst your friends. And of course, please turn around in your comments and ask for more episodes, because the team, I think, are keen to do it. And tell us what you'd like us to see, or what you'd like to see as well. But thank you for watching. I'm Philip Ingram. Goodbye.